that would explain why there is no such E, right? Spinoza has this example, actually since 1p11d2, which is really, I'm so grateful for 1p11d2. He says the reason for the non-existence of a square circle is that it has a contradictory nature, right? And I think Dan said at some point that the existence of units wouldn't involve a contradiction. I think it doesn't involve a contradiction. Otherwise, it couldn't be a brute fact. Since it's a brute fact that E does not follow from God's nature, it's got to be in some sense conceivable that E does not follow from God's nature, or E does follow from God's nature. Either way, it's conceivable. Just as it's conceivable that H follows from God's nature, or H doesn't follow from God's nature. If it's conceivable that E follows from God's nature and that E doesn't follow from God's nature, that's going to be an important point, because if it's conceivable that E follows from God's nature, then it could have been the case that God's nature was present and E was present, that the series of units was present. But if it's conceivable that E follows from God's nature, if it's conceivable that units exists, then God would have had a different nature, because God's nature is such that, as it stands, it does lots of things, but it gives rise to Harry, and H, the series of Harry. If it's conceivable that the series with units exists instead, if that's conceivable, and it must be conceivable because it's not a contradiction to say that units exist. If it were a contradiction to say that E, the series of units exists, then that would be the reason why E, that series, doesn't follow from God's nature. But for again, it's really important that E doesn't follow from God's nature. There's no reason for that fact that E doesn't follow from God's nature. So it's conceivable that E does follow from God's nature. And if E had followed from God's nature, then God's nature would have been different. Okay? And so that there's another conceivable nature of God, besides the nature that God actually has, which gives rise to Harry and H. There's another conceivable nature of God that gives rise to E and units. It doesn't actually go that way, but it's a way that God, as it were, could have been a conceivable nature of God. So there are two different conceivable natures of God. I think that's what Dan's view, that this following from relation is a brute fact. That it's a brute fact that E does not follow from God's nature, but H does. If that fact of entailment is a brute fact, then there's going to be two different conceivable natures of God that give rise to those two different conceivable scenarios. But, as Dan mentioned, Spinoza is a proponent of the ontological argument, and so for him, any conceivable substance exists. This is the main thrust of Proposition 7, Part 1, which gives rise to Proposition 11, where it does prove that God exists. So any conceivable substance does exist. If there are two conceivable natures of God, then both of those natures, as it were, must be instantiated or something. So there would be two gods, right? And that, now, of course, Spinoza would never say that, right? Two gods, right? Spinoza believes in one substance, one God, and all that. So to say that the fact that H follows from God's nature and E does not is a brute fact. To say that is actually to be committed to the claim that there are two different conceivable natures of God, and both of which are instantiated, and that's the end of the world, right? Something's monism. And this is exactly how Spinoza argues in 1p33d. He said this is his argument. He's not interested so much in the unicorn problem, but he's interested there. Could there have been another possible series? He says, no, there couldn't have been another possible series, because then there would have had to be another possible God, that's a conceivable God, possible God, and so both of those gods would have been instantiated, and that would be unacceptable. So I think this, using Spinoza's own reasoning in Proposition 33, that can lead us to see how it can't be the case that the brute fact that Dan is appealing to is really a brute fact. So what then is the reason for the fact that God's nature entails H, the series with Harry? I think the simple answer is that God's nature explains not only H, or that H exists, but it also explains the fact that H follows from God's nature. Remember, God is self-caused and self-conceived. And so part of God's being God's causing himself, God's causing itself, is that God causes which facts follow from God's own nature, right? That's the explanation. It's not a brute fact. It all flows from the fullness of divine being, the fullness of divine being. And so it all follows from that. So I think that's the explanation. That may not be a satisfactory explanation, because well, what is it about God's nature that makes it lead to H rather than E? I'm not answering that question. I'm saying that there must be an answer, perhaps something that we can't fully grasp, that explains why it is that H follows. One thing, a really interesting passage, I know this is, I think, one of Dan's favorite passages, the divine good pleasure argument. I like that too. It's hard to know what's going on there. Dan invoked that passage, in a nice way to show, to support the view that there's this brute fact. And the divine good pleasure argument is that, look, he says, look, everything happens necessarily. That's what he's saying in Proposition 33, the scholium. Everything happens necessarily. So the view that he's really opposed to is a view where God is guided by some kind of thing external to himself, itself. God is guided by a kind of standard of goodness that God is like following. Okay, what do I do now? What do I do now? Right? So, in acting, right? So, that's the view that's totally wrong. It's better, Spinoza says, a better view, not his own view, would be this divine good pleasure view, is that God does whatever you want, just for fun, whatever. That's better, and his own view, Spinoza thinks his own view is the best view, where God acts absolutely necessarily in each case. Now, Dan takes it that what Spinoza likes about the divine good pleasure argument is that God there is acting without a reason. I don't think that's the feature that Spinoza's like applauding with one hand right there. I don't think that's the feature Spinoza's applauding. I think the feature that Spinoza's applauding in the divine good pleasure argument is that there's nothing external to God that's leading to or determining God's actions, right? In the passage, and it's on Dan's handout near the end, what he's saying that he's objecting to in the views which, or the third best views that where God's acting by an external standard, he says they seem to place something outside God to which God attends as a model. That's what he's worried about there, right? And what he likes about the divine good pleasure view is that nothing's being placed outside of God, right? And that's more keeping it with his mind. That's why he likes the divine good pleasure argument. It's not so much that he likes the fact that in the divine good pleasure argument, God is just acting for fun. I don't think that's the relevant thing that he's praising there. Okay, so let me turn to some methodological differences. How are we doing for time?
You're doing good.
Okay. And again, I think that the methodological differences, these are the most interesting issues of all in some sense. All this other stuff we've been discussing is about Spinoza interpretation, and these points about methodology apply to, I think, history of philosophy in general. So this is really important stuff to discuss and think about. I think there are 4 potential methodological differences between us that Dan is calling attention to in his paper. Let me go through them. One is that Dan mentions at some points that my reading is less direct than his reading of Spinoza, and my reading is kind of a rational reconstruction of Spinoza. It won't surprise anyone to hear that I'm not opposed to rational reconstruction, and it's okay in my book. But I want to say that still my reading is grounded in the text. I do want, it's important for me to be grounded in the text. And I think that Dan and I are in the same business. We're both trying to make what Spinoza says intelligible. Not that everything Spinoza says has to itself be intelligible, but we're trying to make intelligible Spinoza saying what he says. That's our common project. We're both in that business. But I think that any interpretation, perhaps short of reproducing the text itself verbatim, and perhaps not even that, I think any interpretation is going to be something of a rational reconstruction. Because any interpretation is going to be important by making explicit what's not explicit in the text, bringing parts of the text to bear on each other in ways that weren't obvious from the beginning, or bringing in considerations from outside the text that might have a bearing on the meanings of the text. So we're always doing things to the text. We're always, and that's a kind of reconstruction. So there's just a difference of degree. There's no purely direct reading. That's impossible. Here I sound like a literary theorist, and I don't mean to, but this is there's no direct reading of the text. There's maybe more or less direct, but that's just a matter of degree. I think that any interpretation is going to be a rational reconstruction. We can never just receive a text passively. Interpretation is an activity, and thus something akin to reconstruction, at least to some degree. So I think that first difference about my reading not being a direct reading and Dan's reading being direct is actually not the case. Another difference that Dan appeals to, he points out that in my interpretation, Spinoza is a principle kind of guy, and on his interpretation of Spinoza is not a principle kind of guy. Here, I think this is just a matter, this may be a first order difference and not a methodological one, because I, may be saying that, and Dan obviously disagrees, that the principle of substitution does govern a lot of the system. So there's an overarching principle at work there. And Dan disagrees with that. But that's a first order disagreement, and that's not a methodological disagreement by itself. But in the vicinity, there is a methodological disagreement between me and Dan. Perhaps it's this. I may be more willing to see Spinoza in terms of a single principle that governs the whole system. And Dan might be less willing to attribute a single overarching principle to Spinoza's system. But that's an interesting difference, but neither approach is by itself problematic. It would be problematic if I insisted dogmatically that there must be a single principle overarching in Spinoza's system. But I don't say that. I do come to that conclusion on the basis of my readings of the text and certain textual evidence. And Dan would have a different reading, and that would be a first order disagreement. So there is a methodological difference there, but I don't see that my greater willingness to see a single principle at work is by itself problematic. Another very closely related difference is that Dan suggests, and this is right, that Spinoza doesn't necessarily have an overarching narrative within the ethics and across the various other works of Spinoza. And there's more of an overarching narrative going on in my interpretation of Spinoza, but I see the narrative as governed by this concern with intelligibility. Right? I'm a narrative kind of guy, as well as a principle kind of guy. And again, this may be a first order difference, but it's not a methodological difference. It's not problematic anyway, unless again I were to assume dogmatically there must be a single narrative in all of Spinoza's work, independently of any textual evidence. But there is a methodological difference here, is that I am more open to there being a single general narrative that structures the ethics and other works than Dan is. But again, that by itself is not problematic unless one is dogmatic. Another methodological difference is that comes up at a couple of points, I think, in Dan's paper, is that I draw connections between Spinoza's work and contemporary philosophy. I did that more in my previous book on Spinoza. I had a whole section, and I'm not sure I would do this now, on Spinoza and Quine, and then another whole section on Spinoza and Davidson. But I'm happy to, and I like seeing Spinoza in connection with contemporary philosophy, and historical figures in general that I work on in connection with contemporary philosophy. And Dan doesn't do that, or is less likely to do that than I am. And sometimes even I don't do what might seem to be non-historical work. I might do straight contemporary work in philosophy, or that might be seen as apparently straight contemporary work. Now here I have, in the paper, the written version of the paper, there's a footnote. I call it a subversive footnote. And so let me tell you the subversive footnote, because I'm going to come back to it later. In the subversive footnote, I say there's no distinction between the pursuit of philosophy and the study of the history of philosophy. I'm not sure if there is a distinction between the pursuit of philosophy and the study of its history. I think that's true. So I don't view my purely, as it were, straight metaphysical work as different in kind from my work in the history of philosophy. I think there's actually no principal difference between. I'll come back to that at the very end. Okay, so there is a difference between us, and this is really, I think, interesting and illuminating about whether and how much to bring in contemporary philosophy and our understandings of the historical figures. Now, let me just make 4 points about my my drawing of connections to contemporary philosophy when interpreting Spinoza or other people. First is that I'm interested not only in contemporary connections, but also in connections to other periods of philosophy. Particularly, in a lot of my work since the book, I've been interested in connections between Spinoza and ancient philosophy, as it were. So I'm also very interested in drawing connections back in time rather than connections to contemporary philosophy. Another point is the poor old Spinoza point, is that sometimes you have people, interpreters, fortunately less so nowadays, to say, poor old Spinoza, he didn't read on denoting. So, only so far you can go, right? And if only he had read on denoting, he would have been saved from this. That's not what I do. Right? I don't say that Spinoza had the misfortune of being born in the 17th century. I would have loved to have been born in the 17th century in some respects. Other things I wouldn't like that. But Spinoza, I don't have that kind of trope where people are say, well, we have now made such progress in philosophy that we can see the mistakes of the old people for what they are, just glaring confusions or something. That's not my approach, right? If anything, this is now the third point, the connections I draw with contemporary philosophy are contrast to contemporary philosophy, and perhaps I might be more willing, it's more likely that I'm going to see the Spinozistic point as critical of what's going on in contemporary philosophy. That's more likely what the kinds of connections that I'm interested in drawing. And in particular, I think that, as I say in the handout, I think that if we took Spinoza's insights more seriously, we could be finally led away from the atomism that is very dominant in contemporary analytical philosophy, and we could be led away from the realism. People mean different things by realism, but it might provide, looking at Spinoza might provide alternatives to the realism and atomism that seems to be almost dogmatically assumed in many stretches of analytical philosophy today. This is connected to my idealist reading of Spinoza, by the way, this kind of non-realism. And the fourth point, very briefly, fourth point is that the contemporary connections don't I'm not being motivated by the contemporary connections. I'm driven instead by the text, and along the way, I might draw these contemporary connections, and then along the way, I might make criticisms of contemporary philosophy. And as I say here, in light of features, I mean 1 through 4, and I get to B. My greater willingness to draw contemporary connections, you might see non-problematic. So I'm more nuanced, I think, than some others have been who draw contemporary connections. Now, there might be a pattern to the genuine methodological differences. So B, C, and D, I think, are more genuine methodological differences. I think there might be a pattern at work there. And this is kind of rough, and I think Dan disagrees, and so we'll see. And it might be the case that the best way to see these differences, the genuine differences between us, is not in terms of the superhero motif, which I like, but I'm not sure if that's the best way of getting at it, but rather in terms of the contrast between more holistic and less holistic approaches to the study of the history of philosophy. So we agree that there are a variety of motivations going on in Spinoza, and I agree totally. My work hasn't focused on Spinoza's political philosophy, but I've written some on that. It's not. One of my work has been primarily metaphysical in Spinoza, but I agree that he has all these motivations about human flourishing, about how to get along in society, I think where we differ is that I see the PSR as sort of playing some role in all those motivations and backing up all of those motivations. Dan is more likely to see these motivations as relatively independent, sometimes in conflict with each other, and I'm more likely to see them as more unified. So that's a kind of holism in my approach. I'm more likely to see the motivations as sort of structured and cohering with one another. Dan, he says he likes to weave different themes that may be clashing sometimes, and that's a nice picture too, but my picture is more of a unified picture. That's one aspect of holism. Another aspect of holism is that I see Spinoza's texts in light of other views, earlier and especially later, And I think that in doing so, I'm saying that Spinoza's views and contemporary views are not independent. They have a bearing on one another. They can be understood in terms of one another. So this too is, I think, a kind of holism that is involved in my approach. In general, I don't see the history of philosophy is isolated from contemporary philosophy. The meanings of historical texts and contemporary views are almost interpenetrating, as it were. So it's not an isolationist approach here. And that's a kind of holism too. Now I think that let a thousand flowers bloom, neither a more holistic nor a less holistic approach is superior to the other. I think they're both good ways to see the text and to get illumination. It's hard to do the history of philosophy. And so we should just try to get illumination from anywhere we can. And so it's good to have versions of more holistic and less holistic views. Perhaps Dan's views and my view are different in approach, perhaps, and it's good to have all of them. I think that the real Spinoza is the Spinoza whose actions and statements can be made intelligible, can be rationalized by whatever means we can. Right? So that's the real historical Spinoza. It's a Spinoza whose actions are made intelligible. The real is the rational, right? To be Spinoza is to be intelligible as Spinoza. And so there's lots of different ways to make Spinoza. So Dan's making Spinoza intelligible, mostly. And I've learned a lot from Dan's papers on Spinoza as well, of course, on Descartes. Forget about it, right? That's all been important. But we're all trying to make Spinoza intelligible, and that's the real Spinoza. Now there might be a respect in which the more holistic method that I'm sort of proposing might be especially appropriate in understanding Spinoza. And to see that point, I just want to turn for a moment to the geometrical method in Spinoza. And so one of the nice things about the geometrical method in Spinoza, and here it is that the geometrical method starts with, among other things, the definition of God and substance, and uses axioms to deduce claims about everything else that follows from God's nature. And so, in a way, the geometrical structure mirrors the ontology of Spinoza's system. The ontology of Spinoza's system is that you start with God, and then you get down to other things. And the geometrical method mirrors the structure in the content of Spinoza's philosophy. So there's a nice convergence of form and content in Spinoza's philosophy of the geometrical method. Similarly, perhaps, if you have this relatively more holistic method of interpretation, that might be especially pleasing in light of the holistic nature of the content of Spinoza's philosophy, because he's a monist and he's a holist in some sense, and you could debate about that. So that might be something to be said in favor of a holistic method for interpreting Spinoza. But again, all methods of interpreting Spinoza are valuable and appropriate. Let me just mention something that actually wasn't in the paper. This is actually just because I want to get back to that subversive footnote about whether there's a distinction between the history of philosophy and the pursuit of philosophy itself. And I think that to justify that kind of claim, you need something like a radical theory of meaning. And I think a theory of meaning that's extremely holistic in the spirit, again, of Quine and Davidson, but perhaps even more extreme version of holism than Quine and Davidson. And if you have this kind of extreme holism of meaning, where there's no differentiated meaning, as it were. And Quine gets close to this point in Two Dogmas, when after he's rejected the analytic synthetic distinction, he says, look, there aren't these individual meanings. Rather, he says, the unit of empirical significance is science as a whole, right? So there are no individual meanings, rather there's just meaning, as it were. Meaning fills the world. And I think that's actually some of the kind of rationalist arguments that I think are at work in Spinoza lead to that kind of theory of meaning. If you have that theory of meaning, then it's that kind of extreme holism, and I'm not justifying it here, but if you have that extreme holism, then for the meaning of any one thing, anything else is in principle relevant to the meaning of any one text or thought, etc. Right? So then in principle, of course, historical texts are relevant to the meaning of our contemporary views, because everything's relevant to the meaning of everything. So of course, the history of philosophy is relevant to contemporary philosophy. You can't really do contemporary philosophy, pursue contemporary philosophy, without bringing in history of philosophy, because the historical text, as it were, in part, fix the meaning of our contemporary views. And similarly, maybe a little surprisingly in the opposite direction, the meaning of the historical text, if this radical holism is correct, the meaning of the historical text is fixed by other things, including our contemporary texts, right? So you can't really do history of philosophy without an eye to the contemporary text, because you don't want to shut yourself off from one legitimate source of meaning. The meaning of the historical text is fixed by, among other things, the contemporary text. So in this way, I think that philosophy, as it were, contemporary philosophy expands to include what would normally be regarded as history, and the history of philosophy expands to include what would normally be regarded as contemporary philosophy. There's no principal division there between philosophy and its history, and there's no principal division between the pursuit of contemporary philosophy and the study of the history of philosophy.